Pay attention to the Muslim activist in the center kneeling. His name is Ayub. He's leading highway prayers with fellow protesters during rush hour. Then, supernatural wind strikes, temperature drops, and he abruptly stands up, abandoning his prayer.
My name is Ayub, and on June 17, 2019, I was a 28-year-old devoted Muslim activist living in downtown Chicago. That morning, I organized what I believed would be a righteous highway prayer protest to honor Allah and defend our religious freedom. Instead, something supernatural happened that completely shattered everything I thought I knew about God and prayer. I was raised in a household where Islam wasn't just a religion, it was the very foundation of our existence. Every single day began at 4:30 in the morning with the call to Fajr prayer echoing through our small apartment on the south side of Chicago. My father would wake us with a gentle shake, his calloused hands rough from years of construction work, but his voice always soft when he whispered the sacred words that meant it was time to connect with Allah. Prayer was never optional in our family. 5 times daily, without exception, we would stop whatever we were doing and face Makkah. I remember being 7 years old, playing with toy cars in the living room when the call to Maghrib prayer came. My mother would gently take the toys from my hands and guide me to the prayer rug, teaching me how to position my small body in submission to Allah. There was beauty in that routine, a rhythm that governed our entire lives and gave me a sense of purpose that many of my American classmates seemed to lack. My father served as an imam at our local mosque, a position he took with tremendous seriousness and pride. He would spend hours preparing his Friday sermons, poring over Arabic text and commentaries, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he worked late into the night. I used to watch him from the doorway of his study, mesmerized by his dedication and hoping that one day I would possess even a fraction of his knowledge and devotion. He taught me that prayer was not just communication with Allah, but a demonstration of our complete surrender to His will. My mother complemented my father's teaching with her own gentle but firm guidance. She taught Quran classes to the neighborhood children every Saturday morning in our mosque's basement, and I was always her star pupil. She made me memorize entire surahs, testing me while she cooked dinner or folded laundry. Her voice was melodic when she recited verses, and I learned to mimic not just the words, but the reverent tone she used when speaking Allah's words. She taught me that every prayer was a privilege, an opportunity to speak directly with the Creator of the universe. Growing up in this environment, I developed an unshakable conviction that Islam was not just the truth, but the only path to salvation. I watched my non-Muslim classmates with a mixture of pity and confusion, wondering how they could live such seemingly purposeless lives without the structure and meaning that prayer provided. When they spent their mornings sleeping in or watching cartoons, I was already on my second prayer of the day. When they ate lunch without even thinking about where their food came from, I always paused to thank Allah for His provision. By the time I reached high school, I had become something of a religious leader among my peers. I started a Muslim student association and organized prayer groups during lunch breaks. I wasn't content to simply practice my faith privately. I felt called to share it, to demonstrate to my classmates and teachers that Islam was a beautiful, peaceful religion that deserved respect and recognition in American society. I organized cultural events, invited speakers to our school, and even convinced the administration to provide a quiet room where Muslim students could pray during school hours. College only intensified my religious fervor. I studied Islamic history and theology, diving deep into the writings of scholars and reformers who had shaped modern Muslim thought. I learned about the struggles of Muslims around the world, the discrimination they faced, the way their religious practices were often misunderstood or suppressed. I began to see myself not just as a practicing Muslim, but as an activist, someone who had a responsibility to defend my faith and my community against ignorance and prejudice. The idea of public prayer as a form of religious demonstration wasn't something I invented. I had read about Muslim communities in other countries who gathered in public spaces to pray, making visible statements about their faith and their right to practice it openly. I had studied the civil rights movement and admired how Christian leaders had used their faith as a foundation for social action. I began to believe that American Muslims needed to be bolder, more visible, more willing to inconvenience the comfortable majority in order to claim our rightful place in society. Ask yourself this question: what would drive someone to risk arrest, public ridicule, and community backlash for the sake of a religious principle? For me, it wasn't just about the right to pray. It was about dignity, about refusing to hide my faith in private spaces while others got to express their beliefs openly and without shame. I had grown tired of seeing my religion portrayed as dangerous or foreign in the media. I wanted to show America what real Muslim devotion looked like: peaceful and beautiful and worthy of respect. The highway protest wasn't a spontaneous decision. I had been planning it for months, carefully studying traffic patterns and consulting with other community leaders about the best way to make our statement while minimizing actual danger. I convinced myself that blocking traffic for the few minutes it would take to complete our morning prayers was a small price to ask society to pay for the powerful statement we would make about religious freedom and Muslim visibility in America. I recruited followers through social media, mosque announcements, and personal conversations with the most dedicated members of our community. I framed it as a sacred duty, chance to follow in the footsteps of the Prophet Muhammad himself, who had prayed openly despite persecution and opposition. I told them that sometimes faith requires us to be uncomfortable, to take risks, to make sacrifices for the greater good of our community and our religion. Looking back now, I can see how my righteous anger had slowly consumed my heart. I was no longer praying out of love for Allah, but out of defiance toward a society I felt had marginalized and misunderstood us. I had convinced myself that disruption was devotion, that inconveniencing others was somehow a form of worship. I believed with every fiber of my being that what we were planning was not just justified, but holy. That Tuesday morning began like any other day of prayer, but the anticipation coursing through my veins made everything feel electric and significant. I had barely slept the night before, spending hours in my apartment reviewing our plan, checking weather reports, and sending final instructions to the 200 fellow Muslims who had committed to joining me. My prayer rug was rolled up by the door along with a megaphone I had borrowed from our mosque and a small cooler of water bottles for anyone who might need them during our demonstration. I arrived at the predetermined meeting spot, a McDonald's parking lot 3 blocks from our target intersection, at 5:30 in the morning. The sun was just beginning to peek over the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across the empty lot. One by one, cars began pulling in, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. I watched as families emerged, fathers carrying prayer rugs, while mothers adjusted their hijabs and children rubbed sleep from their eyes. These were good people, devoted people, who were willing to sacrifice their comfort and safety because they believed in what we were doing. Brother Ahmed, an older man who had emigrated from Pakistan 30 years ago, was among the first to arrive. He walked up to me with his weathered hands clasped behind his back and a serious expression on his face. He had raised 6 children in America and owned a small grocery store in our neighborhood. When he told me he supported our protest, I knew we had the blessing of our community's most respected elders. Sister Fatima brought her teenage sons, both of whom played basketball at the local high school and had never been involved in any kind of activism before this morning. As more people gathered, I felt the weight of leadership settling on my shoulders. These people were following me, trusting my judgment, believing that I had heard correctly from Allah about what we needed to do. I had convinced them that this act of public prayer would somehow advance the cause of religious freedom and demonstrate the peaceful nature of our faith to a watching world. Standing there in that parking lot, surrounded by fellow believers who were willing to risk arrest because of my vision, I felt more righteous, justified than I ever had in my entire life. We spent 20 minutes reviewing the plan one final time. I reminded everyone that we needed to move quickly and efficiently once we reached the highway. The goal was to spread across all 4 lanes of the intersection at Roosevelt and State, one of the busiest crossroads in downtown Chicago during morning rush hour. We would lay out our prayer rugs in organized rows, just as we did in the mosque, and complete our Fajr prayer while the city watched. I estimated it would take no more than 10 minutes, just long enough to make our point without causing serious harm to anyone's commute. The walk to the highway felt like a pilgrimage. We moved in small groups, carrying our prayer rugs and maintaining the quiet, reverent atmosphere that should precede any act of worship. I could hear some of the brothers quietly reciting verses from the Quran as we walked, preparing their hearts for what we were about to do. The mothers kept their children close, whispering instructions about how to behave once we reached our destination. Everyone understood that we were about to do something unprecedented, something that would likely be recorded and shared across social media within minutes. When we reached the edge of the highway, I could see the morning rush hour traffic already building. Cars were moving at a steady pace in all directions, filled with commuters heading to office buildings and coffee shops, completely unaware that their normal routine was about to be dramatically interrupted. I felt a momentary flutter of nervousness in my stomach, but I pushed it aside and reminded myself that prophets and activists throughout history had faced similar moments of doubt before taking actions that would change the world. I raised my hand to signal the beginning of our demonstration, and 200 Muslims stepped into the intersection as one unified body. The first cars to encounter us honked their horns and swerved to avoid us, their drivers leaning out windows to shout questions and complaints. Within seconds, traffic began backing up in all directions, as more and more vehicles came to a complete stop, unable to proceed through the intersection that we now occupied. We spread out across all 4 lanes exactly as we had practiced. each person finding their designated spot and rolling out their prayer rug with practiced precision. I took my position at the very center of the intersection, facing east toward Mecca, and felt the eyes of hundreds of angry commuters focused on me. Car horns were honking constantly now, creating a cacophony of noise that seemed to rise up around us like an urban symphony of outrage and confusion. The shouting started almost immediately. Drivers were rolling down their windows and yelling at us to get out of the road, to stop blocking traffic, to take our prayers somewhere else. Some of the language was harsh and profane, filled with the kind of anger that comes from having your normal routine disrupted without warning or explanation. A few people got out of their cars entirely, standing by their open doors and waving their arms in frustration as they tried to understand what we were doing and why we were doing it. But instead of feeling intimidated or ashamed by their anger, I felt more justified than ever. Their outrage proved my point about how little respect American society had for Muslim religious practices. Here we were, engaged in the most peaceful and beautiful act imaginable, connecting with our Creator through prayer, and they were treating us like criminals or terrorists. Their hostility only confirmed everything I believed about the prejudice and intolerance that Muslims faced in this country. I knelt down on my prayer rug and began reciting the opening verses of our morning prayer, my voice strong and clear despite the chaos surrounding us. The familiar Arabic words felt powerful and defiant as they left my lips, each syllable a declaration of our right to worship Allah wherever and whenever we chose. Around me, my fellow protesters followed my lead, their voices joining together in the ancient rhythm of Islamic prayer that had been practiced by millions of believers for over 14 centuries. The anger from the drivers only made me more determined to complete our demonstration with dignity and grace. I wanted them to see that we were not dangerous or threatening, that we were simply people of faith expressing our devotion to God in the most sincere way we knew how. I believed that once they witnessed the beauty and peacefulness of our prayer, some of their hostility might transform into curiosity or even respect. We were halfway through the Fajr prayer, deep in the second rak'ah, when something absolutely impossible began to happen around us. I was in the middle of reciting Surat al-Fatiha, my forehead pressed against my prayer rug as I performed sujood, when I felt the first stirrings of wind against my back. At first I thought nothing of it. Chicago is a windy city, and morning breezes are common, especially in the open spaces between tall buildings. But this wind was different from anything I had ever experienced. The wind began as a gentle stirring, barely noticeable except for the way it seemed to move in perfect circles around our group. I lifted my head slightly during my prostration and noticed that loose papers and debris from the street were not scattering randomly as they normally would, but instead were being caught up in spiral patterns that defied every law of physics I had learned in school. The wind was moving in organized, deliberate circles, as if some invisible hand was stirring the air around us with supernatural precision. Within seconds, the gentle breeze transformed into something far more powerful and unnatural. The wind began to howl with an intensity that made it impossible to ignore, even for those of us trying to maintain our focus on prayer. I could hear Brother Ahmed next to me, struggling to continue his recitation, as his prayer cap was lifted from his head and sent spinning through the air. Sister Fatima's hijab was whipping around her face, despite the clips she had used to secure it, and her teenage sons were gripping their prayer rugs to prevent them from being torn away entirely. What made the wind truly terrifying was not just its strength, but its behavior. Instead of blowing consistently in one direction, It seemed to be swirling around our group in perfect geometric patterns. I watched in growing alarm as plastic bottles, loose papers, and even small pieces of gravel were lifted into the air and carried in precise spirals that formed concentric circles around our prayer gathering. The wind was creating visible vortexes in the dust and debris, patterns so perfect and mathematical that they looked like something from a computer simulation rather than a natural weather phenomenon. But the wind was only the beginning of what would become the most supernatural experience of my entire life. As I tried to continue my prayer despite the chaos around me, I became aware that the temperature was dropping at an impossible rate. This was June in Chicago, a warm summer morning when the forecast had called for temperatures in the mid-70s. Yet within the span of perhaps 30 seconds, the air around us became so cold that I could see my breath forming white clouds every time I exhaled. The temperature drop was not gradual or subtle. It was dramatic and instantaneous, as if someone had opened a massive freezer door and released Arctic air directly into the intersection. I could see vapor rising from the asphalt around us as the warm pavement met the suddenly frigid air. The cars stuck in traffic began producing thick white exhaust clouds as their engines worked harder in the unexpected cold, creating an eerie fog that drifted across the highway and made the entire scene look like something from a horror movie. Every prayer rug around me was now fluttering violently in the supernatural wind, creating a sound like hundreds of flags snapping in a hurricane. The fabric was whipping so aggressively that maintaining any kind of prayer position became nearly impossible. I watched as several of the younger protesters gave up entirely on their prayers and simply held onto their rugs to prevent them from being blown away. The older men, including my respected brother Ahmed, were still attempting to continue their recitations, but their voices were being drowned out by the howling wind and the confused shouts of the trapped motorists. The trapped drivers had stopped honking their horns and shouting complaints. Instead, they were sitting in their cars with wide, frightened eyes, staring at the impossible weather phenomenon that was occurring in the middle of their morning commute. I could see them pointing through their windshields, some taking out their phones to record what they were witnessing, others simply gripping their steering wheels and looking like they wanted to drive away as quickly as possible. But perhaps the most unnerving aspect of the entire experience was the way the supernatural weather seemed to be contained within a specific boundary around our prayer group. I could see that cars just 50 feet away from us appeared to be experiencing normal weather conditions. Their windows were not fogged with condensation, their occupants were not bundling up against unexpected cold, and loose objects around their vehicles were not being caught up in spiral wind patterns. The phenomenon was localized directly over and around our prayer gathering, as if some invisible dome had been placed over us and filled with Arctic wind and impossible weather. Every instinct in my body was screaming that something was terribly wrong, that what we were experiencing was not natural and could not be explained by meteorology or science. I had lived in Chicago my entire life and had never witnessed weather that behaved in such organized, deliberate patterns. Wind does not move in perfect geometric spirals. Temperature does not drop 30 degrees in 30 seconds on a clear summer morning. Weather phenomena do not confine themselves to precise boundaries in the middle of urban intersections. I tried desperately to continue my prayer, to maintain my focus on Allah and ignore the chaos erupting around me. But my hands were shaking uncontrollably from both the cold and a growing sense of fear that I had never experienced before. My prayer beads were clicking together as my trembling fingers struggled to maintain their grip. The Arabic words that had flowed so easily from my lips just minutes before now felt heavy and difficult to pronounce, as if some invisible force was making it harder and harder for me to complete the religious ritual that had brought us to this place. Around me, I could see that my fellow protesters were having similar struggles. Some had abandoned their prayer positions entirely and were standing upright, looking around in confusion and growing alarm. Others were still attempting to pray, but were clearly distracted and frightened by the supernatural events occurring around them. The organized, reverent atmosphere of our prayer demonstration had been completely shattered by forces that none of us could understand or explain. It was in the midst of this supernatural chaos, as the impossible wind continued to howl around us and the temperature remained unnaturally frigid, that I heard something that would forever change the trajectory of my life. At first I thought the voice was coming from one of my fellow protesters, perhaps Brother Ahmed, trying to call out instructions over the noise of the wind. But as I lifted my head from my prayer rug and looked around, I realized that everyone else was either struggling to maintain their prayer positions or staring in confused silence at the weather phenomenon surrounding us. The voice was not audible in the way that human speech is audible. It did not enter my ears and travel to my brain through the normal mechanisms of hearing. Instead, it seemed to speak directly into my consciousness, bypassing my physical senses entirely and communicating with some deeper part of my being that I had never known existed. The voice was clear and unmistakable, more real and present than any sound I had ever heard, yet completely unlike anything I had experienced in 28 years of life. When the voice spoke, it said words that struck me like a physical blow to the chest. It said, "Ayub, why do you pray in anger when I call you to pray in love?" The question penetrated through every defense I had built around my heart, cutting through years of religious training and theological certainty like a sword through paper. The voice knew my name, knew the condition of my heart, and was asking me to examine motivations that I had never honestly confronted before. The moment I heard those words, I knew with absolute certainty that this was not Allah speaking to me. In all my years of Islamic study and prayer, in all the hours I had spent in mosques listening to imams and reading theological texts, I had never encountered anything that suggested Allah would speak in this way or ask these kinds of questions. The voice had a quality of intimate knowledge and personal concern that felt completely foreign to everything I understood about Islamic theology and the nature of divine communication. My entire body began to shake uncontrollably, not just from the supernatural cold that continued to surround us, but from a terror that went deeper than any physical discomfort. The voice had exposed something about my heart that I had been hiding even from myself. The truth was that My prayer had become contaminated with anger, resentment, and the desire to prove something to the world rather than genuinely connect with God. I had been praying not out of love and devotion, but out of defiance and religious pride. As this realization crashed over me, I felt every theological foundation I had built my life upon beginning to crumble. If this voice was not Allah, then who was speaking to me? If my prayers had been motivated by anger rather than love, then what did that say about the sincerity of my faith? If everything I thought I knew about God and prayer was wrong, then what was I supposed to believe? The questions came flooding into my mind faster than I could process them, each one undermining another piece of the religious certainty that had defined my identity. I tried to return to my prayer, to ignore the voice and the questions it had raised, to focus on the familiar Arabic words that had always brought me comfort and spiritual grounding. But every time I attempted to continue my recitation, I felt an overwhelming resistance, as if some invisible force was preventing me from completing the religious ritual that had brought me to this intersection. The words felt heavy and meaningless in my mind. Mouth, empty syllables that no longer carried the spiritual power they once possessed. The voice spoke again, and this time its words were even more devastating to my understanding of reality. It said, "I know your heart, Ayub. I know the anger you carry against those who do not understand your faith. I know the pride that drives your public prayers. But I am calling you to something greater than religion. I am calling you to relationship." These words hit me with such force that I physically recoiled, my hands flying to my chest as if I had been struck by lightning. How could this voice know the intimate details of my spiritual condition? How could it see through the religious facade I had constructed around my real motivations? I had convinced myself that my activism was pure, that my desire to pray publicly was driven by genuine devotion to Allah and concern for my community. But this voice was revealing that my heart harbored anger, pride, and a desire for recognition that I had never admitted even to myself. Look deep into your own heart right now and ask yourself this question. What would you do if everything you believed about God was suddenly called into question by a supernatural encounter? What would happen to your sense of identity if the voice of God Himself contradicted everything your religion had taught you about His nature and desires? In that moment on the highway, I felt my entire worldview collapsing like a house of cards in a strong wind. I became aware that my hands were shaking so violently that I could no longer maintain any pretense of continuing my prayer. The prayer beads I had been clutching fell from my trembling fingers and scattered across the asphalt, the small wooden spheres rolling away from me like my faith itself was disintegrating. My breathing became rapid and shallow as panic began to set in, not just from the supernatural events occurring around me, but from the existential crisis that was erupting within my soul. Around me, my fellow protesters were still struggling with the impossible weather, but they seemed unaware of the voice that was speaking directly to me. Some were still attempting to pray despite the wind and cold, while others had given up entirely and were standing around looking confused and frightened. But none of them appeared to be experiencing the personal, intimate divine communication that was systematically dismantling everything I thought I knew about God. The voice spoke one final time, and its words were both a comfort and a terrifying challenge. It said, "Come to me, Ayub. Stop performing religion and start receiving love." In that moment, I understood that this was an invitation, not a condemnation. Whatever divine presence was speaking to me was not angry or judgmental, but was offering me something I had never known existed. It was offering relationship instead of ritual, love instead of law, grace instead of performance. I could no longer maintain my prayer position. My legs gave out from under me, and I found myself sitting on my prayer rug in the middle of the intersection, surrounded by supernatural wind and impossible cold, while tears I did not understand began streaming down my face. Everything I had built my life upon was crumbling, but something new and inexplicable was being offered in its place. I stood up from my prayer rug with such abruptness that several of my fellow protesters turned to stare at me in confusion. My legs felt unsteady beneath me, as if the supernatural encounter had drained all the strength from my body. But I knew with absolute certainty that I could not remain in that intersection for another second. The voice that had spoken to my heart was still echoing in my consciousness, and every fiber of my being was screaming that I needed to get away from this place and process what had just happened to me. Without saying a word to Brother Ahmed or Sister Fatima or any of the other devoted Muslims who had followed me into this demonstration, I turned my back on the prayer gathering and began walking toward the edge of the highway. Behind me, I could hear confused voices calling my name, asking where I was going, reminding me that our prayer was not yet complete. But I could not turn around. I could not explain what I had experienced because I did not understand it myself. The walk away from that intersection felt like the longest journey of my entire life. With each step I took, I was not just leaving behind a prayer demonstration, but abandoning everything that had defined my identity for 28 years. I left my prayer rug lying in the middle of the highway, the same rug my grandmother had given me when I turned 13 and began praying as an adult. I left behind the community of believers who had trusted me enough to risk arrest and public humiliation because they believed in my vision of public Islamic worship. For the next several weeks, I lived in a state of spiritual and emotional turmoil that I had never experienced before. Sleep became nearly impossible because every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice asking me why I prayed in anger when I was being called to pray in love. I found myself unable to perform my regular prayer routine because the familiar Arabic words felt hollow and meaningless in my mouth. When I tried to face Mecca and recite the verses I had memorized since childhood, all I could think about was the supernatural presence that had called my motivations into question. The reaction from my family was immediate and devastating. My father, the respected Imam who had raised me to be a devout Muslim leader, was completely bewildered by my sudden change in behavior. When I tried to explain that something had happened during the prayer demonstration, that I had heard a voice that was not Allah speaking to me, he looked at me with a mixture of concern and disappointment that broke my heart. He suggested that I had been overwhelmed by the stress of organizing such a large protest and that I needed rest and spiritual counseling. My mother responded with the kind of deep, soul-wrenching grief that only a parent can feel when they believe their child is in spiritual danger. She began crying every morning when I failed to join the family for Fajr prayer, and I could hear her sobbing in her room late at night as she prayed for Allah to restore my faith. She prepared special meals for me, thinking that perhaps poor nutrition was affecting my spiritual condition. She invited various religious scholars to our home, hoping that someone with greater theological knowledge could help me work through whatever spiritual crisis I was experiencing. My younger brother Muhammad, who had always looked up to me as a role model of Islamic devotion, became increasingly angry and confrontational as my behavior continued to change. He could not understand how I could abandon the faith that had given our family meaning and purpose for generations. During one particularly heated argument, he accused me of betraying not just our religion, but our entire family heritage. He said I was bringing shame on our father's reputation in the community and causing our mother unnecessary suffering with my spiritual confusion. The consequences extended far beyond my immediate family. Within days of the highway demonstration, word had spread throughout our mosque and the broader Muslim community that I was experiencing some kind of religious breakdown. The Imam who supervised my work at the Islamic Center called me into his office and gently but firmly suggested that I take an extended leave of absence until I could resolve whatever spiritual issues I was facing. He was kind but clear that my current state of mind made me unsuitable for any leadership roles within the community. Losing my job was devastating, not just financially, but emotionally. The Islamic Center had been more than my workplace. It was the hub of my social life, my sense of purpose, and my identity as a community leader. Suddenly, I was cut off from the daily interactions with fellow Muslims that had sustained and encouraged me for years. I no longer had access to the library of Islamic texts that had been my constant companions, and I was no longer invited to the planning meetings where community leaders discussed important issues affecting our neighborhood. The isolation became almost unbearable. My closest friends, all devout Muslims who could not understand my sudden spiritual transformation, gradually stopped calling and visiting. They were not intentionally cruel, but my questions and doubts made them uncomfortable, and they seemed to fear that whatever spiritual illness I was experiencing might somehow be contagious. I found myself spending long hours alone in my apartment, staring at my collection of Islamic books and wondering how everything I had once believed with such certainty could suddenly feel so foreign and distant. But even in the midst of this crushing loneliness and family rejection, I could not deny what I had experienced on that highway. The voice that had spoken to my heart remained more real and vivid than any memory I possessed. Despite the pain it was causing me and everyone I loved, I knew that I had encountered something supernatural, something that demanded a response, even if I did not yet understand what that response should be. It was during this period of spiritual searching and social isolation that I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I decided to learn about Jesus, not because I had any intention of converting to Christianity, but because I needed to understand who or what had spoken to me during that prayer demonstration. If the voice was not Allah, as I was certain it was not, then I needed to discover its true source, even if that discovery led me into territory that my Islamic upbringing had taught me to avoid. I began this investigation secretly, using public computers at the library to research Christian theology and the teachings of Jesus. I was terrified that someone from my community might see me reading Christian materials, but my need to understand what had happened to me was stronger than my fear of further rejection and criticism. 3 months after that life-changing encounter on the highway, I found myself standing outside Grace Community Church on a cold October morning, my hands trembling not from the weather, but from the magnitude of what I was about to do. I had spent weeks researching this particular church, reading their website, studying their statement of beliefs, and even driving past the building several times without getting out of my car. Everything in my upbringing screamed that entering a Christian church was a betrayal of everything I had been taught about God and faith. But the voice I had heard during the prayer demonstration continued to echo in my heart, calling me towards something I did not yet understand. The pastor who greeted me at the door was nothing like what I had expected. Pastor David was a gentle man in his 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile that immediately put me at ease. When I introduced myself and explained that I was a Muslim who had experienced something supernatural that I needed to discuss, he did not seem shocked or uncomfortable. Instead, he invited me into his office and offered me coffee, while I struggled to find words for the experience that had turned my world upside down. I told him about the highway protest, about my lifelong devotion to Islam, about the supernatural wind and impossible cold that had surrounded our prayer gathering. I described the voice that had spoken directly to my heart, asking why I prayed in anger when I was being called to pray in love. I explained how the encounter had left me unable to continue my Islamic prayers and had cost me my job, my community, and the respect of my family. As I spoke, tears began flowing down my face, the first tears I had allowed myself to shed since that devastating morning 3 months earlier. Pastor David listened to my entire story without interrupting, nodding occasionally and maintaining eye contact that conveyed both genuine interest and deep compassion. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment before responding with words that I will never forget. He said, "Ayub, what you experienced was not unusual or strange. Jesus has been meeting people exactly where they are for 2,000 years. He met Saul on the road to Damascus. He met the woman at the well in Samaria. And he met you on a highway in Chicago during a prayer demonstration." His response was so different from what I had expected that it took several seconds for his words to fully register. I had prepared myself for skepticism, for theological arguments about the impossibility of what I claimed to have experienced, for attempts to convince me that my encounter had been psychological rather than supernatural. Instead, this Christian pastor was treating my story as completely normal and was suggesting that the voice I had heard belonged to Jesus Christ himself. Pastor David opened his Bible and began reading passages about Jesus calling people away from religious performance and toward authentic relationship with God. He read about the Pharisees, who were so focused on external religious observance that they missed the heart of what God truly desired. He read about Jesus criticizing those who prayed publicly to be seen by men, rather than praying privately out of genuine love for their Heavenly Father. With each verse he read, I felt as though he was describing my exact spiritual condition during those months leading up to the highway demonstration. For the first time since that supernatural encounter, I began to understand what had happened to me and why. The voice that had spoken to my heart was not rejecting prayer itself, but was calling me away from prayer that had been contaminated by pride, anger, and a desire for recognition. Jesus was not asking me to stop communicating with God, but was inviting me to discover a completely different kind of prayer, one based on love and relationship, rather than ritual and performance. Pastor David explained that Christianity was not simply another religion with different rules and requirements, but was fundamentally about a personal relationship with God through Jesus Christ. He told me that Jesus had come to earth not to establish a new set of religious obligations, but to remove the barriers between God and humanity that had been created by sin and religious pride. He said that following Jesus meant receiving God's love as a free gift, rather than trying to earn divine approval through religious performance. That morning in Pastor David's office, everything that had been broken inside me since the highway encounter began to be healed and restored. For the first time in months, I felt peace settling over my heart like a warm blanket. Understood that the voice I had heard was not condemning me, but was offering me something infinitely better than anything I had known before. Jesus was not asking me to abandon faith, but was inviting me to discover what genuine faith really looked like. When Pastor David asked if I wanted to surrender my life to Jesus Christ, I did not hesitate for even a second. I had been searching for 3 months to understand what had happened to me, and now I knew that this moment was the purpose toward which everything had been leading. I knelt in his office and prayed the most honest prayer of my entire life, acknowledging that my religious efforts had been insufficient, and asking Jesus to forgive my sins and become the Lord of my life. The peace that flooded my heart in that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced during years of Islamic prayer and religious devotion. It was not the temporary satisfaction that comes from completing a religious duty, but the deep, lasting peace that comes from knowing that you are completely accepted and unconditionally loved by the Creator of the universe. For the first time since childhood, I felt truly free from the burden of trying to earn God's approval through religious performance. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself whether you have ever experienced this kind of peace. Have you ever known what it feels like to be completely accepted by God, not because of what you have done, but simply because of who He is? This is what Jesus was offering me during that supernatural encounter on the highway, and this is what He offers to every person who is willing to stop performing religion and start receiving His love. My conversion to Christianity did not solve all my problems immediately. My family's rejection became even more intense when they learned that I had not simply lost my Islamic faith, but had actively embraced what they considered to be a false religion. My father refused to speak to me for over a year, and my mother continued to weep and pray for what she saw as my eternal damnation. The Muslim community that had once respected me as a leader now viewed me as an apostate and a traitor. But none of that mattered because I had found something that was worth any sacrifice. Prayer was no longer a ritual I performed 5 times daily to fulfill religious obligations. Instead, it had become an ongoing conversation with a God who knew my name, understood my heart, and loved me unconditionally. I no longer prayed to earn divine favor or to demonstrate my religious devotion to others. Instead, I prayed because I was in relationship with Jesus Christ, and communication with someone you love is never a burden, but always a joy. The angry, prideful young man who had organized that highway demonstration was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true spiritual strength comes not from public religious performance, but from private surrender to the love of God. I learned that Jesus was not interested in my ability to organize protests or lead prayer demonstrations. He was interested in my heart, my willingness to receive His grace, and my desire to love others the way He had loved me. If Jesus can reach a Muslim activist who was praying in the middle of a blocked highway, driven by anger and religious pride, then He can reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. My name is Ayub, and this is my testimony of how Jesus transformed a heart that was broken by religion and restored it through relationship. He is still calling people today, just as He called me on that supernatural morning in Chicago. The question is not whether He is speaking, but whether you are willing to listen and respond to His voice of love.